Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles. I am the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana at 5600 Van Road. If you'd like to stop by and visit us, you can find us there at 10 a.m. every Sunday morning for worship. You can also get there an hour early next Sunday at 9 for our Bible study. You can also worship with us on Sunday afternoons if that's more convenient at 4 p.m. And then we have the other half of our Bible studies on Wednesday evenings at 7. Classes for all ages. If you'd like to get in touch with us, then feel free to give us a call or send a text to 812-550-6234. You can also send emails to info@riverridgechurch.org, and we'd love to hear from you and get back to you as soon as we can. And I encourage you to check out our YouTube channel, youtube.com/River Ridge Church of Christ, where you can find all of our worship services at those times that I mentioned are live streamed there, and also the entire backlog of our TV programs is also available on that YouTube channel. That is particularly pertinent on a day like today because we are doing another installment in the ongoing series in which we look at books of the Bible. All of that series is up on YouTube, and you can look at the basic overviews in which we do a sort of 40,000 foot level, and then you can also get into all of the nitty-gritty of each particular book as we have been doing for quite some time. Today we are looking at 1st and 2nd Chronicles in the Old Testament. Now, almost 3 months ago, we looked at 1st and 2nd Kings, which appears just before Chronicles in the arrangement of the canon, and we found in 1st and 2nd Kings the history of the two nations of Israel and Judah, which are really one nation but two separate countries throughout the period of the divided kingdom. And that begins actually during the United Kingdom with Solomon as the king, around about the year 970 or so BC, and then it goes all the way down through the Babylonian captivity, which begins in the early 6th century BC. There were some lessons that we learned across the course of the books of the Kings, and the foremost one is just that it's hard to find a good ruler. We also saw a lot of examples of good guys doing some evil things and also some evil guys doing some good things, and had to work to reconcile that in our minds and then apply what we saw there to our own situation today. We saw a pattern of God granting more blessings and less wrath to whichever of the two nations, messed things up the least between the two. And for the most part that was Judah, although not always. The books of the Kings are mostly written from the perspective of the northern kingdom, Israel. And of course Judah in the south is mentioned and its kings are summarized, but the central characters, guys like Elijah and Elisha, and then later I suppose Jehu sort of falls into that category, well, they're all northerners. And that seems surprising because the northern kingdom is the one that went into captivity sooner, and the southern kingdom hung on for almost another 150 years after the north collapsed. So the focus was on the north until that northern kingdom fell apart. And at that point, then the focus shifted south, of course, until Judah also fell apart in the early 6th century. Now, Chronicles covers, mostly the same timeline as Kings, but from a southern perspective throughout. I want to mention two quirks about Chronicles. The first is that it begins with genealogies. And these genealogies don't start with Solomon. They start all the way back at Adam, and then the chronicler works his way up through the reigns of Saul, who is kind of glossed over, and David, who's kind of condensed from 2 Samuel, but with some additions as well. And then finally Solomon, with whom 1st Chronicles ends and 2nd Chronicles begins. From that point, after Solomon wraps up, 2 Chronicles 10 through 36 covers the same ground as 1 Kings 12 through 2 Kings 25. Obviously, there's a lot more there. There's a lot more material, a lot more words in 1st and 2nd Kings. 27 chapters in Chronicles covers the same timeline as 36 chapters in Kings. So we would expect that Chronicles is probably a bit more concise through this period, but it's actually not. Instead, the way that the chronicler accomplishes this is to eliminate Israel's story for the most part and focus just on Judah. And once you do that, well, you've got roughly half as much material to work with. You can actually focus more. You can give more information about what happened in Judah, even over a shorter amount of text. So that's the first quirk, the arrangement, let's say, with the genealogies and this disproportionate focus on a handful of things early on. The second quirk is that Kings tells us more about the final days leading up to Judah's fall to Babylon than Chronicles does. So it's not as simple as, well, Kings is about Israel and Chronicles is about Judah. That is the general rule, but there are exceptions to it within Kings and Chronicles. Let's talk about the authorship for a moment. Tradition ascribes the authorship of 1st and 2nd Chronicles to Ezra, the Ezra who's behind the book of Ezra. And that's a nice idea. I kind of like it, but it doesn't really matter all that much in the end. Whoever compiled it, he is explicitly working from earlier sources. These would be things like court annals and other books that had been written by particular prophets or particular officials and that sort of thing. 1 Chronicles 29, verse 29. Now the acts of King David from first to last are written in the Chronicles of Samuel the seer, and in the Chronicles of Nathan the prophet, and in the Chronicles of Gad the seer. 2 Chronicles 9:29. Now the rest of the acts of Solomon from first to last, are they not written in the history of Nathan the prophet, and in the prophecy of Ahijah the Shilonite, and in the visions of Iddo the seer concerning Jeroboam the son of Nebat? Chapter 12, verse 15. Now the acts of Rehoboam from first to last, are they not written in the Chronicles of Shemaiah the prophet, and of Iddo the seer? Chapter 13, verse 22. The rest of the acts of Abijah, his ways and his sayings, are written in the story of the prophet Iddo. There are more examples of this. We've got multiple different prophets or seers and officials in books of Kings and books of Chronicles and so on and so forth. Now, in its final form, 1st and 2nd Chronicles actually ended up being the last Old Testament book written, and it therefore appears at the very end of the Hebrew canon. By the way, this is attested by Jesus in Luke chapter 11, verse 51, where Jesus is tearing into the Pharisees and he mentions the martyrdoms of the prophets, verse 51, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, it will be required of this generation. Now, it's convenient and handy that in English it goes from Abel to Zechariah, i.e. from A to Z, but that's obviously not what Jesus had in mind, given that, well, the English language didn't actually exist yet when he said this, and certainly that's not the language in which Jesus was speaking. He was speaking in either Aramaic or in Greek. In either case, he is referring to a sort of A to Z list, but it's not A to Z, the beginning and end of the alphabet. Instead, it's more like saying from Genesis to Revelation, the beginning of the canon to the end. Abel, of course, is the first one to basically to be killed for his righteousness in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, and the last one in the canon to be killed for his righteousness is a man named Zechariah. Not the literary prophet who has a book toward the end of our Old Testament called Zechariah, but rather a different Zechariah at a different period of time in the Old Testament. In fact, it's in 2 Chronicles chapter 24, during the reign of King Joash. The Spirit of God clothed Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada the priest, and he stood above the people and said to them, Thus says God, Why do you break the commandments of the Lord so that you cannot prosper? Because you have forsaken the Lord, he has forsaken you. But they conspired against him, and by command of the king they stoned him with stones in the court of the house of the Lord. So, while 1st and 2nd Chronicles appear roughly halfway into the canon of the Old Testament in our English Bibles, the Hebrew arrangement is different, and it puts 2nd Chronicles at the very end instead of in the middle. So I've given you a bit of an introduction to the books. Now, what I want to do for the rest of our time is to go through, and obviously there's a lot for us to cover, but we will summarize the contents that we find and look for some major themes along the way. And of course, I'm guiding you and picking out particular readings for that purpose. And as a result, we'll be able to see lessons that Chronicles holds for us today. Let's begin in 1 Chronicles chapter 1, verse 1. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The sons of Japheth, Gomer, Magog, Medai, Yavan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tirash. The sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. The sons of Javan, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Rodanim. These genealogies continue through chapter 9, verse 44. I'll spare you. Some general notes. We have genealogies particularly of Abraham's family, and then we have a genealogy particular to David's family. We also have genealogies of the 12 tribal leaders or tribal patriarchs' families, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and so on and so forth, the sons of Jacob. We have a genealogy of Saul's family. It seems like that should come before David's, but they're all kind of haphazardly lumped together. There's a reason for that. It's not totally random, but nevertheless there it is. And then finally the genealogy of the returned exiles and their families. In chapter 11, let's read the first 3 verses. Then all Israel gathered together to David at Hebron, and said, Behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, even when Saul was king, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord your God said to you, You shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over my people Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord. And they anointed David king over Israel, according to the word of the Lord by Samuel. This comes after a 1-chapter-long preface about Saul, and then from here on in chapter 11, the focus remains on David for quite some time, and so a lot happens. David takes Jerusalem, he makes it into the capital of his country, he takes the ark to Jerusalem, he houses it in a tent, glossing over a lot of details, and then we get into some lists, things like David's armies and his captains. This would be I suppose the first and probably the best example of the inventories that appear in this book. There's quite a few of them. Then we get to the covenant that God makes with David, and we see that in 1 Chronicles 17. Let's start reading that. Verse 1. Now when David lived in his house, David said to Nathan the prophet, Behold, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of the covenant of the Lord is under a tent. And Nathan said to David, Do all that is in your heart, for God is with you. But that same night the word of the Lord came to Nathan, Go and tell my servant David, Thus says the Lord, It is not you who will build me a house to dwell in. For I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up Israel to this day, but I have gone from tent to tent, and from dwelling to dwelling. In all places where I have moved with all Israel, did I speak a word with any of the judges of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people, saying, Why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now therefore, thus shall you say to my servant David, Thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, to be prince over my people Israel, and I have been with you wherever you have gone, and have cut off all your enemies from before you. And I will make for you a name like the name of the great ones of the earth, and I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. And violent men shall waste them no more, as formerly, from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel. And I will subdue all your enemies. Moreover, I declare to you that the Lord will build you a house. When your days are fulfilled, to walk with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for me, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. I will not take my steadfast love from him, as I took it from him who was before you, but I will confirm him in my house and in my kingdom forever, and his throne shall be established forever. We had occasion to talk about this same conversation when we looked at the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, because those focused on David. And this exact same conversation, one-sided though it is recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 7. It introduces some key themes. There are some messianic hints within it. From here on, we get into lists and such about David's administration and his military achievements. We also get into David's sin and repentance in chapter 21. Not the one with Bathsheba. That's actually not even mentioned here in 1 Chronicles. Some related events are mentioned in passing, but Bathsheba and Uriah, that whole thing gets a complete pass. But I want to talk about this other sin of David's, which is recorded also at the end of 2 Samuel. David wants his people to be counted, and his military captain, Joab, says this is a bad idea. Why? Why would that be a problem? Well, David wants to know what his military strength is, which seems to be an indicator that he's not trusting God in the same way that he used to do. David has fought battles for many, many years. He has often, perhaps usually, been the underdog in these battles. Now that he's the undisputed power of a huge region, now he's assessing his own strength. Joab's not a great guy. He's a multiple murderer, he is a co-conspirator with David in effecting one murder, but he was a very effective general. And he also had a profound sense of loyalty to David. He counsels against it, and in fact it's for the right reasons, and when David pushes it through, God punishes David. And he punishes David by sending a pestilence on the people, which means that David sinned, and yet it's his people who are getting the penalty. David pleads with God to spare his people because Well, what I just observed. David is the one who sinned. They don't deserve this. And God provides him an out. In chapter 21, verse 18. Now the angel of the Lord had commanded Gad to say to David that David should go up and raise an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. So David goes and buys this property. He does as he was told to do. Let's jump down to verse 28. At that time, when David saw that the Lord had answered him at the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite, he sacrificed there. For the tabernacle of the Lord, which Moses had made in the wilderness, and the altar of burnt offering were at that time in the high place at Gibeon. But David could not go before it to inquire of God, for he was afraid of the sword of the angel of the Lord. Then David said, Here shall be the house of the Lord God, and here the altar of burnt offering for Israel. The threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite is on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. That introduces the idea of the temple, which is going to fill most of the next 15 chapters. We get a lot about the preparation, the collection of materials, and of course scoping out the location and getting that all set, the provisions for labor to get it done, the leader involved in it, because David, remember, he's preparing for it, but God told him, you're not going to be the one to build it, rather your son will. And so David's son Solomon, the king who follows him, is going to be the one who actually oversees the building of this temple. And by the way, throughout all of this, we get more and more of these inventories, these lists of lots and lots of things, materials, and also what is being done with the materials. We get to some more of David's organization. His religious organization covers much of chapter 23 through 26, and those are basically still part of preparation for the temple, I suppose we could say. We get an interlude about the military and administrative organization, which we already sort of touched on, but, nevertheless, as long as we're doing inventories, let's just throw them all out there. And then we get back into temple prep with plans for it and instructions for building it and the offerings that the people gave for it. And finally, 1 Chronicles ends with the death of David and his replacement by Solomon, his son. Seems like 1 Chronicles didn't really cover all that much, while the pace speeds up considerably in 2 Chronicles. We get 7 chapters at the beginning on temple construction and dedication and God's approval of it, and then we still mostly follow the actions of kings, but it's only the southern ones this time. Remember, the north is barely even mentioned in 2 Chronicles, which is to say that what we're doing is following the Davidic line of kings, which is appropriate, all things considered. The Davidic line of kings is also the lineage of the Messiah, and it's the fulfillment of that big promise that God made to David back in chapter 17. After that, we get like 2.5 chapters for the rest of Solomon's 40-year reign, which I suppose shows something about the relative importance of the temple and everything else. The rest of Solomon's reign is characterized by his wisdom and peace and wealth. The bad parts, which were prominent in 1 Kings, are left out of 2 Chronicles. Chapters 10 through 36 cover the remaining 19 kings of Judah. So Rehoboam gets 3 chapters, Abijah gets 1 chapter, Asa gets 3 chapters, Jehoshaphat gets 4 chapters. That includes Jehoshaphat's religious reforms as well as his social reforms and his, let's say, reformation of the justice system as well. Jehoshaphat would be a big reformer, let's say. After that, we get roughly 1 chapter per king for a while. Extra time is devoted to a couple like Joash and his reforms. He wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, he's the one responsible for the murder of Zechariah, but he also tamped out worship of the idol Baal in Judah, and he also restored the proper temple worship and repaired the temple as well. Hezekiah gets 4 chapters. Again, Hezekiah is a reformer, and so he tends to get more. Hezekiah was getting rid of other idolatry, not just Baal, which has crept back, of course, but other things as well, and getting back to temple worship as God had designed it. He brings back the Passover, which seems like it should never have fallen away, but nevertheless, there it is. He also made peaceful religious overtures to the remaining stragglers who were in the remains of the northern kingdom. Chapter 33 is devoted to the reign of Manasseh, whom 2 Kings presented as a horrible king. And 2 Chronicles agrees, but it also includes the story of his repentance, and that ends with his own reforms, which basically amount to his attempt to undo his previous evil. I'd like to read a few verses of that. The Lord spoke to Manasseh and to his people, but they paid no attention. Therefore the Lord brought upon them the commanders of the army of the king of Assyria, who captured Manasseh with hooks, and bound him with chains of bronze, and brought him to Babylon. And when he was in distress, he entreated the favor of the Lord his God, and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. He prayed to him, and God was moved by his entreaty, and heard his plea, and brought him again to Jerusalem into his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord was God. Afterward he built an outer wall for the city of David west of Gihon in the valley, and for the entrance into the fish gate, and carried it around Ophel, and raised it to a very great height. He also put commanders of the army in all the fortified cities of Judah, and he took away all the foreign gods and the idol from the house of the Lord, and all the altars that he had built on the mountain of the house of the Lord and in Jerusalem, and he threw them outside of the city. He also restored the altar of the Lord, and offered on it sacrifices of peace offerings and of thanksgiving, and he commanded Judah to serve the Lord, the God of Israel. Good for him. There are a couple of chapters on Josiah, who is credited with clearing out idolatry completely, finally tearing down the high places, which had been a problem for centuries, like even before the monarchy began. God seems to have tolerated and even half endorsed it, at least until his temple was built, but it was supposed to stop then, and it didn't. Josiah brought about a realigning of the national attitude with God's law. And then, that brings us to chapter 36, which covers 4 kings, and the exile, and the return. That's like 100 years in one chapter. Verse 15. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent persistently to them by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they kept mocking the messengers of God, despising his words, and scoffing at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, until there was no remedy. Therefore he brought up against them the kings of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young man or virgin, old man or aged. He gave them all into his hand, and all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and of his princes, all these he brought to Babylon. And they burned the house of God, and broke down the wall of Jerusalem, and burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious vessels. He took into exile into Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days that it lay desolate it kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years. Now in the first year of Cyrus king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus king of Persia, The Lord the God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him. Let him go up. And that's Chronicles. What made it different from 1st and 2nd Kings? Why did we bother to have 2 concurrent histories of the Israelites and their kings in this one book? Well, the main focus and the themes are different. Kings was concerned chiefly with politics. Chronicles is concerned chiefly with religion. The main thrust of Kings was to see rulers behaving badly. The main thrust of Chronicles was to see God keeping his promises despite his people's bad behavior. That's why there's such a focus on the genealogies, by the way, and the vindication of the covenant with David that we talked about earlier, but also with the covenant with Moses and with Abraham. The continuity of David's line seems like it would be more political than religious, but Chronicles was written at a time when there was no Davidic king on a throne. Now, his descendant Zerubbabel governed in Judah, but that was done at the pleasure of Babylon and without any royal titles or throne. Ezra, or whoever is the author, couldn't have fully understood why this was so important, but we know from the New Testament that promise was more about Christ than about David's kingship over this piddly little nation of Israel, which, even when it was the dominant political force in the region, was very small in comparison to Egypt's heyday or Assyria's or Babylon's. God likes to demonstrate his power and his loving kindness by doing great things to, for, and through what appear to be very small nations and tribes and peoples in human terms. Chronicles also highlights that God takes his house and his worship very seriously. That seems like it would be obvious, but it's not given a whole lot of attention today. Has he changed his mind on this point? Now, of course, God doesn't expect his house or his worship to look exactly the same today as it did in physical terms in the Old Testament, but in spiritual terms, there's really not much difference, except that now our worship can be more real, whereas Israel had just a shadow. Turn to Hebrews chapter 8, and I'd like to read the first 6 verses. Now the point in what we are saying is this: We have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain." But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. We should look to the New Testament for substance, but to the Old Testament for shadows that help us to better understand the substance. God didn't want impurity involved in his worship. He wanted his ideas to be implemented and was often less than thrilled with man's innovations. His people generally slid farther and farther from his pattern, and they had to be reminded and corrected from time to time. He blessed those who led the charge in bringing the people's behavior and hearts back to God. We also saw throughout 1st and 2nd Chronicles his love and his willingness to forgive. That was first on a national scale, and we can also see it on an individual scale with someone like David, who sinned with the census that he enacted, but he was also forgiven after he repented. We could also mention Jehoshaphat. We didn't have much time to talk about him, but he got too chummy with a bad influence, Ahab, the king in the north, and God rebuked him for that. Jehoshaphat turned around and worked extra hard to turn the nation around too. He repented, and God blessed him for it. We mentioned Manasseh. Almost his entire reign was terrible. Then he was captured by an enemy, humbled, and completely turned around. He attempted to undo his former sins. Now, his son was Ammon, who was terrible, just terrible. He only reigned for 2 years, and then he was assassinated by his own household. That gives you some idea. But Manasseh's grandson, Ammon's son, Josiah, well, we talked about him. He was like the best king they ever had since David. One wonders where Josiah learned his complete devotion to God. It certainly didn't come from his father. Maybe his grandfather? We don't know. Regardless, it's not just the important people, the politically powerful people that God cares about. He cares about you too. Your choices matter. Each choice that you make brings you, and potentially the people around you, either closer to or farther from God. Which direction are you going? Be grateful that God is always waiting for sinners to turn to him. Jesus preached parables about this, the prodigal son and others like that. But remember, you don't actually know that you have much time to turn back. And every step that you take away from him makes the journey back that much harder. Like the nation of Judah, we all need periodic correction and reorientation. I encourage you to take whatever steps are necessary to humble yourself before God and align yourself with his will. Maybe you need to be baptized into Christ and become a member of his holy people and turn away from the worthless pursuits of the world. Maybe you've already done that, but have strayed from the path and need to return to it. Maybe you're still on the path, but you just need to adjust your course in order to stay on the path before you head off the rails. Whatever is your need, we would be glad to help at River Ridge. You can get in touch with us by phone at 812-550-6234 or email us at info@riverridgechurch.org. You can also find us at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh for Sunday morning worship at 10. I hope to see you there. Thanks for joining me today on Iron Sharpens Iron.